Hi, I'm Benjamin Studebaker.
And I'm Aimee Terese, and this is What's Left.
So, on the episode that you may have just heard about Notre Dame, we talked about the American Notre Dame, which is pronounced like a football player's running the show. But now we're going to talk about Notre Dame, the cathedral, which recently caught on fire, and some of the strange arguments that people have been making about it. And I've noticed at least 4 different species of this, but there are probably more subspecies, and they all have certain things in common, so it's all one genus. The first is a right-wing argument which claims that Notre Dame is a symbol of Western civilization, and that its burning is in some way evocative of Western civilization's decay. And more extreme versions of this... And more extreme versions of this attribute it specifically as indicative of, say, Muslims pouring into the West, or of even Muslims being somehow responsible for the fire, but the French state having covered it up, these unhinged conspiracy theories that come from InfoWars. So that's one genre here. The second is a kind of inverted version of that, in which these people agree that Notre Dame is a symbol of Western civilization, but they say, and that's whiteness, and whiteness is bad, and colonialism is bad, and since Notre Dame is a symbol of those things, the fire's good, and it's good that it's burned, and France is an imperial colonial power, and fuck them, and fuck the cathedral. So that's the second category.
Sorry.
That's I say the F word because that's basically what they're saying. I'm not endorsing the use of the term.
No, I know. Yeah.
The third argument is a kind of what about. So it's what about all of these other churches or all of these other religious sites that are important that people don't care about and people don't talk about? Why don't people care about or talk about these other things? And the fourth is a more specific what about, which is why don't the rich people donate their money to other things, to other charities, to other causes, to stuff to do with hunger or the poor or malaria or something. So these are 4 different arguments, 4 different ways of trying to appropriate Notre Dame for some contemporary political purpose. And as a person who teaches history of political thought, it bothers me when contemporary people try to make everything about them, because a lot of stuff that exists that's old was built for reasons that have nothing to do with these kinds of reasons, and have nothing to do with modern debates about race or civilization or the relationship between church and state, conceived it through this liberal secular kind of lens. The church-state relationship they were interested in was very different. Very different. There was no liberal secular lens. The whole question was, how could the Catholic Church and the king help legitimate each other? How could they cooperate to secure order? And that's what Notre Dame was built for. It was built to express this partnership between the French Capetian monarchs and the popes. And it was commissioned in the 12th century by Louis VII and Alexander III, who came together to lay the initial groundwork for it. And this was at a time when France was not a united state, where the King of France only controlled a relatively small area around Paris, and most of France was controlled by independent counts and dukes, or by England, which had colonized virtually the entire western half of France. And it was really about trying to legitimate the French king's authority by connecting and associating the French king with God, with the church, with the good in some abstract theological sense. And for people to take that and to take the project of constructing this medieval state and make it about their petty shit annoys me. It annoys me a lot, especially because so many of these people aren't using it to promote any kind of positive view of the world, but they're just using it to promote concepts that aren't constructive. Especially these first two groups, which I think are basically two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, the right, who says it's about Western civilization, oh, how terrible that it's burned. And on the, I guess they would call it the left, people saying, oh, it's a symbol of whiteness, it's great that it's burned. These people basically are using Western civilization and whiteness to mean the same thing. And their only difference is in their normative attitude. But they both think Notre Dame is about the same thing. And Western concepts of the nation state, of whiteness, of race, of civilization, these things didn't exist when Notre Dame was constructed. And it's kind of vulgar for them to claim it in the name of these relatively recent conceptual creations. And
this is all well and good, Benjamin.
Egotistical. It's egotistical.
I hear you're egotistical, and I raise you just a counterpoint. So you mentioned that the idea of Notre Dame, when it was built, was an attempt to unify a somewhat divided France, an attempt to legitimize the rule of the kings. Is this correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think what you failed to consider from your standpoint is that, in fact, these men were already unified by their whiteness, and the age of legitimacy for cishet white male dude bros, that is over. OVAH. Over. Okay?
They didn't even have the idea of whiteness at the time.
Because they were
the
blinded
concept.
to it by their standpoint epistemology. Because whiteness was the default. Duh.
You literally have a state during the medieval period that's called the Holy Roman Empire. And it's trying to claim, the Holy Roman Emperor is trying to claim that he's emperor of the entire Roman world, which is a world that includes Africa. And the Roman citizens of Africa had the same political rights that Roman citizens in other provinces had. It just shows so much ignorance of history and indifference to the possibility that we could think about constructing human society in other kinds of ways, with other kinds of concepts. This idea that these racial concepts, these ethnic or nationalist concepts, are fundamental and that we have to acknowledge them or we have to integrate them into everything. It's a bunch of fake nonsense that people made up just a couple hundred years ago. And it doesn't have anything to do with most of human history. And we keep reading these modern concepts back into the past, projecting our contemporary concerns onto people from the past. And it impoverishes us because if we think that everybody always thought like a 21st century liberal, if we think that 21st century liberalism is all anybody's ever believed, then we lose one of the best things that you get from looking at the history of thought, which is the possibility that we could think in other ways. One of the things that's remarkable about studying medieval political thought, for instance, is just this realization that everyone agreed, virtually everyone agreed on divine right of kings in the Middle Ages. It was the dominant legitimation mechanic in the way that democracy is the dominant legitimation mechanic now. And the fact that today virtually no one believes in divine right of kings. It's a dead idea. If you told people in 1250 that we were going to come to a time when nobody believed that kings were divine in the West, they'd look at you like you were crazy. And it's inspiring to see just how much our ideas can change. But you don't get any of that if you just ignorantly project contemporary concerns back onto every historical moment without paying any attention.
I mean, I know he's deemed a reactionary at this point, but I really think that Christopher Lasch was onto something with cultures of narcissism. Like, this type of rampant projection is pure fucking cultural narcissism.
And these people in the contemporary debate think that everything should be about their group interest. And they don't have any sense of solidarity, and they don't have any sense of working together with anybody for any larger collective goods. And since everything is about their pet project, of course they have to make history about them. They can't make anything about anybody who isn't them. And I say that about both the right-wingers and these woke-skulled anarchists. They just make everything about them.
Yeah, it's premised on what I see as a really neoliberal zero-sum logic that I think is... It's the type of logic that should be applied to a critique of capital, but unfortunately, the majority of political engagement in the neoliberal era is through a totally race reductionist identitarian lens. And so you apply this totally zero-sum logic to people and interests and things that are have moral worth, and you frame that as zero-sum. And you turn none of that critical zero-sum logic towards capital, which is in fact where it should be directed, right? You turn the zero-sum logic to, the fucking binary that is class interests. And you look in a solidaristic way at things that are worthy of moral concern. But instead, this race reductionist identitarianism seeks to carve up and atomize issues of moral worth and says fucking nothing about capital. And I just find it deeply depressing, because the extent to which the whole decline of the West, alt-right paranoid garbage is the exact mirror image of the, centrist neoliberals who are saying that this is, a monument to whiteness that should be rebuilt with a view to diversity or some shit. What?
These people who want to reconstruct the ceiling in some kind of modern style as a big finger to the right. Just make it look ugly to upset people. How about that? That's the proposal.
Intersectional architecture.
And one of the things that they ignore, of course, because they are so intent on this racialized lens for understanding Notre Dame, is that many Catholics care deeply about this building. And many people who have been to Paris or who have been to France or who have French friends, family members, care about this building. And many of those people are Hispanic, they're Black. Africa possesses many former French colonies. Many people who live in those places still have some tie to France, even if they feel very conflicted about it in many cases because of the colonial history. There's still often deep connections to France in the Francophone world. And many people in those countries are Catholic, and they care. And to say that they're not allowed to care about that because it's European, or they're not allowed to care about that unless they're also going to care about stuff that happens in countries they have no connection to, or stuff that happens to religious buildings that aren't their religion, it's not reasonable. If you're Catholic or if you're French or if you're Francophone, you do have reasons to care more about this than if you're not. And you do have more reasons to care about it than you have to care about something that happens somewhere else with some other building or some other grove of trees or whatever it might be. And it's not about race. It's simply about if you have Catholic religious beliefs, then a Catholic church is going to matter to you, especially an exceptionally beautiful Catholic church. And if you have been to France or you love Paris, this is going to matter to you. And it's going to matter more to you than a place you've never been or something you've never seen. And the notion that having stuff that you care about more than other stuff makes you some kind of racist, it's ridiculous. They're imposing the frame on everything, regardless of whether it's fair or unfair, whether it works or doesn't work. And this is really much too far because this pre-exists that entire debate, this building, and it just has nothing to do with them. And yes, right-wingers have tried to appropriate it and have tried to make it theirs. So why are you giving it to them? Why are you helping the right turn this into a symbol of something racist so that you can then be in the horrible position of having to advocate the destruction of a beautiful building to make a point?
So, Benjamin, you don't think we should, quote, give Notre Dame a modern roof the alt-right will hate, end quote?
No, because it's ugly. People don't hate these modern roofs because they're racist. They hate them because the roofs are ugly. People have aesthetic tastes. People wouldn't love Notre Dame if it were constructed in a way that isn't aesthetically pleasing to them.
Okay, so I'm reading from an article written on the 19th of April by Erika Harlitz-Kern, and the title was what I just referred to. And I'm just going to read a little bit here, Benjamin, that I think you should possibly respond to. If you ask me today, if you ask me, in honor of Notre Dame's history, the new roof needs to be a brand new design, representative of today and not of the past. Why? Well, the restoration and preservation of historical buildings is based on an idea that there is an original state of things that can be reached if later additions and influences are done away with. The idea of there being an original state of things is also what dominates the worldview of the far right, who use their interpretation of the Middle Ages as a template for how they believe society should be. While Notre Dame
That's not at all
burning,
true. Can I just make a point? That isn't at all true.
Please do.
The people in the far right want nation states, and they have a nationalist conception that comes out of the French Revolution and Napoleon Bonaparte. That is several hundred years after the Middle Ages are done and over with. They don't have anything that remotely looks like a medieval conception of politics. From the point of view of medievalists, their obsession with the market and economic growth and their obsession with the nation rather than God and the church would be deeply repulsive. And conservatives, people who had more medieval orientations, the aristocrats in the 17 and 1800s, and the priests and the churches in the 17 and 1800s looked on the bourgeois liberals with disdain and the bourgeois nationalists with disdain. They thought that they were an entirely vulgar group of up-jumped shopkeepers with no aesthetic taste. And now these people try to claim the monuments that were constructed by the old landed aristocracy as their own. These capitalists think that they own or have something to do with the things that were constructed by the landed gentry of the Middle Ages? Nuh-uh. They don't. And we shouldn't give it to them.
It's very sweet, Benjamin. You're bringing all these facts to a culture war fight.
Well, it just aggravates me. And then you've got the people who say, well, why are the rich people giving money to that? Why don't they give it to other things? Well, have you noticed that rich people, because you don't tax their money, tend to spend their money in ways that aren't socially optimal? Have you noticed that they tend to spend a lot of their money on art and on other stuff that isn't a great investment from the point of view of society, maybe that's a reason to tax them instead of charity shaming individual rich people.
Yeah, the issue isn't what rich people spend their excess money on. It's the fact that rich people have excess money.
Steve Ballmer, the owner of the Los Angeles Clippers, he spent $2 billion on an NBA team that's the 8th seed in the playoffs, is about to get dismantled by the Golden State Warriors. And they've raised, I think it was $600 million for Notre Dame. That's $600 million from a whole bunch of different billionaires versus one billionaire spending $2 billion on a mediocre basketball team. This is who they are. This is what they do. If this is news to you, or if you're surprised by it, you've been out of touch for a while. What were you expecting? And certainly if you're a billionaire who's religious or Catholic, you have every reason to think that contributing to this might help make up for the fact that you haven't given the rest of your money away when you die and meet St. Peter.
Well, there's some continuity with the Middle Ages.
Yeah, the billionaire Catholics who are donating to this have got more in touch with the Middle Ages than anybody else.
Yeah, at least in their praxis.
This isn't an important issue. It shouldn't bother me as much as it does. Yes, go ahead.
This was, dear sweet listener, this was just grinding all of Benjamin's gears. So we thought we might take some time to go through it a little. As a historian who works with material culture, I am well aware of the challenges that come with working on historical buildings, especially those that have been listed as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Nevertheless, Notre Dame's new roof should be a representation of the architecture of the first decades of the 21st century. More in the spirit of the pyramid at the Louvre than the spire that no longer defines the Paris city's silhouette. An acknowledgement of Notre Dame as the result of worldwide impulses across the centuries can be found in the French government's decision to put out a global call for architects to participate in a competition to rebuild Notre Dame. In the words of French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe, the new roof of the cathedral needs to be adapted to the techniques and challenges of our era and is called for by the evolution of heritage. A roof of that kind would be a reflection of an event that has added a new scar to an already battle-hardened building.
If they could build it in the 1100s, they can build it now. And I hate this notion that beautiful architecture is something that doesn't belong, something that you can't build in a modern era. That the architecture of the Middle Ages is not something we can imitate or appreciate as new construction. I'm sick and tired of looking at things like that pyramid in front of the Louvre. My aesthetic taste is not there. Why are we letting these art school architects build stuff that most people don't like?
I mean, I think they can build stuff that most people don't like, but I also just think, like, why bastardize a classic? Like, I don't know, I'm a bit of a pretentious wanker like this. I quite enjoy expensive things in very classic designs because I just find that, like, then I keep them forever. And granted, I don't have a medieval church among my collection of overpriced classics. But, like, to my mind, the idea of writing that we should give a beautiful, like, medieval building a roof that, quote, the alt-right will hate is some of the most petty, reactionary fucking bullshit that I've heard in quite some time. And, like, you read the article and there's literally nothing in there to justify such a preposterous, petty piece of shit claim.
No, there really isn't.
It's really gross to me. Like,
honestly, I think it's motivated in part by cheapness. These are people who don't want to have to spend the money to make an authentically beautiful, custom-made roof. And they would rather just stick a bunch of glass or a bunch of plastic on top of it.
But this
That's
is
what most of these modern people do.
Like, means
cheap
nothing.
Cheap materials, simplistic, unadorned, minimalist designs on buildings. There are places where I like minimalism, but architecture is not one of them.
You're not a fan of just brutalism?
Yeah, on architecture, I like neoclassical stuff. I like Gothic stuff. I like the old stuff on buildings. Why isn't that a legitimate aesthetic point of view to have? Why does that have to be equated with being right-wing politically? One of the things I've noticed, this is a little bit of a tangent. One of the things I've noticed is that there's some kind of expectation that people who are politically left-wing are going to have some kind of a left-wing aesthetic. And this left-wing aesthetic is usually cheap stuff that you would associate with someone who doesn't have a lot of money being able to purchase. And I don't see why these two things have to go together. I like a lot of stuff that is not necessarily cheap. And it's not because it's not cheap. It's just, I like it.
So what you're saying is you're a fancy lad. You're a fancy lad.
Vladimir Lenin wore a three-piece suit all the time. He didn't dress up like he was a hipster. Most people from that era, including most working people, wore pretty nice clothes by the standards of today and didn't go around looking like hippies. Why do left-wingers have to, why are we expected to dress badly and build ugly things? Why is that our aesthetic? Why is it that so many left-wingers on podcasts and so on feel that it's appropriate to speak in that really, really nasally Dan Denver voice?
Because
why do people think that that's...
Because they're vocal fry millennials.
Maybe I have a reactionary aesthetic. Yeah, maybe I have a reactionary aesthetic, but I don't think that there's any duty for left-wing people to not have a reactionary aesthetic.
I don't even know what that means. Like, what the fuck is a reactionary aesthetic?
Well, I think what it would mean if someone wanted to push me is they would say, well, Benjamin, you like all of the stuff that the landed aristocrats liked. You want everything built and designed the way that...
Feudal serf labor. No.
Yeah, and I don't politically agree with any of that stuff, but a lot of the things that they made in the Roman period, in the Middle Ages, in the early modern period, a lot of that stuff is beautiful to me, and I like it, and I would never want it constructed with slave labor or serf labor or whatever, but I like a lot of it.
Well, I think this kind of leans into a lot of what I am constantly whining about, which is that for all these motherfuckers, politics is cosplay. And so the aesthetic is it. And so the idea that you can separate the aesthetic from the political, the aesthetic from, the moral imperatives in which it was created is something that's totally anathema to these people. It's why they have fucking moronic terms like problematic fave. It's why they really shit their bed at the idea of enjoying art that was created by people whose interpersonal behavior is not behavior that they would endorse, because they've so fundamentally conflated the aesthetic and the political and the moral into just this one vacuous mashup that ultimately just turns into politics as fandom, politics as aesthetics. It's like they can't seem to engage with these things in any kind of
so they can't appreciate
fashion.
A beautiful church building without associating it with the politics of the church.
Yes.
Even though the Catholic Church doesn't own Notre Dame anymore, by the way. Doesn't own it.
This is an economic claim. They don't care for economics.
Yeah, they don't. Yeah, they don't care. Yeah, we've talked in the past a lot about the conflation of politics and morality. And occasionally we've talked a little bit about the conflation of politics and aesthetics. Last week when we talked about buttered eggs and his the backrack piece about buttered eggs being not gay enough. That was a purely aesthetic argument. It was just that I don't like the way the kind of music he listens to, or the way he presents himself and talks and dresses. And this is what we're getting into here. We have people who are advocating what is, from an artistic point of view to me, a deadly crime. because they think it makes some kind of political point, which it doesn't make. It doesn't. That art doesn't mean what they think it means. Medieval architecture doesn't mean what they think it means. They don't get to claim it. They don't get to tell me what I have to think about when I look at a building. And they don't get to tell the millions of ordinary people who do not want to look at some god-awful modern albatross on top of a medieval cathedral. Any more than anybody wanted to look at that disgusting pyramid outside the Louvre. How many sites in Paris have to be ruined before we get over this stupid architectural fad? And it all sounds, I'm sure, to many people like a trivial thing. It's just that it's so evocative of so much that is wrong in the way that people relate to each other. That we live in this society now where if you like the wrong kind of music or architecture or film or TV or whatever, somebody's going to tell you that that means that somehow you're a bad person, or that building or that song, that artist, that movie, that show is somehow associated with something that is not okay, and therefore it's problematic, which is their pretentious word for bad, pretentious word for icky.
It also, to my mind, leans all the way into this fucking moronic notion of like ethical consumption is political, right? It's like you can be a vegan in terms of like your cultural consumption or some shit, right? Like if you just make the right consumptive choices, this is somehow political. No, it's fucking not. It's not.
No, if you don't want people buying, I don't know what it might be, meat, for instance, tax it, ban it, turn it into a political cause of some kind. Don't go around shaming people for consuming different stuff from you. Why is your taste in food somebody else's problem? And the same for anything else. Aesthetics is really a matter of personal taste.
Yes, well, you cry for Notre Dame, sure, but why not for treasures beyond the West? Huh?
Because aesthetically, they don't make me feel the same way when I look at them.
Well, last year's fire at this Paris conflagration immediately sparked a social media debate about whether we, citizens of affluent Western countries, experience as much collective grief about cultural tragedies that occur outside the West as we feel about the Notre Dame fire. Last year's fire at the National Museum of Brazil destroyed more than 90% of its collection of 20 million items, including numerous indigenous artifacts. This was a loss far greater than that in Paris, one to rival the destruction of the Library of Alexandria more than 200 years ago. But there was far less media coverage of the Rio Inferno than that in Paris, suggesting perhaps that the cultural heritage in the global south is less precious to us.
Hang on. Firstly, I have been to Paris and seen Notre Dame. I have not been to Rio. I haven't seen that museum. So I have memories and so on, which gives me a reason to care.
Again, cultural chauvinism. Why have you not gone to Rio? Huh?
Secondly, we're not just talking about a bunch of if you're going to make a comparison to the Library of Alexandria, the Library of Alexandria contains texts, books, things people could read, things that give people all sorts of ideas. And if you're going to talk about artifacts like jars and pottery and that kind of stuff, that stuff, while beautiful and valuable, is not like a book.
Okay, well,
you can look at a jar. You can't use it the way that an ancient person would have used it. You can actually read a text by a Greek or Roman writer, and you can engage with that. And the same is true of writers from any other tradition in any other part of the world. I'm not saying that anybody's writing is necessarily better than anybody else's, but I'm saying that stuff you can read is more valuable than stuff that you just look at, to me.
Edgy. But in the Middle East, warfare has been a major cause of cultural loss. But Islamophobia and Eurocentrism means that most citizens of the West are probably less sensitive to destruction of material heritage in that part of the world than we are to the loss of Gothic cathedrals.
I mean, I will say just for a second here that I was really disturbed and upset. And I know it's just buildings and people say, who cares? But I was emotionally bothered when ISIS decided to destroy all of those antique Roman, Babylonian, Assyrian ruins.
Well, this sounds like Islamophobia and or Eurocentrism, my friend. Have you considered that?
What? So now anything that is built before the Islamic period in the Middle East doesn't count as something that belongs to the Middle East? Who says anybody owns any of this stuff? Nobody who's a modern person owns anything that's from the past. You didn't make it. You didn't build it. It wasn't built for you. It's a legacy from the past that we protect because we appreciate the past. It's not because you own it. People in contemporary Europe had nothing to do with building Notre Dame. They're simply its keepers. And people living in the Middle East have nothing to do with a site like Petra. They are simply its keepers. And your job is to keep it. Your job is to maintain it. And if it needs help being maintained, you help. That's your job when it comes to taking care of beautiful old ruins. Your job is to maintain it. And what the French did in allowing that site through austerity to become vulnerable to fire and then botching work on it such that it burst into flames, and now proposing, after having failed to maintain it, that they would put a disgusting roof on top of it that isn't even in keeping with the architectural style. First, they vandalize it through neglect, and now they propose to vandalize it deliberately. You are a modern, contemporary people, and this building does not belong to you and is not for you to treat in this way. It belongs to everybody. And not just everybody alive now, but everybody who will be alive in the future. And your job is not to try to take possession or take ownership of it. Your job is to maintain it so that other people can look at it and appreciate it. And maybe this all sounds very conservative.
Can I just explore the notion of, so something like Eurocentrism is traditionally referred to as a worldview that was biased towards Western civilization, that was basically an apologetic stance towards, colonialism and imperialism and that sort of thing. It may not have been an incredibly precise or programmatic notion, but certainly it had at least some content that could be pointed towards. But to suggest that something like the extent of media coverage of something therefore is indicative of a really thick and substantive set of normative claims beyond the mere fact of Western media reflecting shit that will be of interest to its consumers is a little bizarre to me.
And the notion that Western consumers wouldn't be more interested in Western buildings that they're familiar with than other buildings is silly. And look, there are some things that are very clearly Eurocentric in a way that is not okay, like the international system or international political economy, things that favor rich states at the expense of poor states. And we've talked about that, and we'll continue talking about that. And the distribution of wealth and power in the world is not just and needs to be taken care of. None of that is addressed or administered to in any way by vandalizing ruins. And the notion that vandalizing ruins or whinging about people's aesthetic standards in some way makes up for the actual disparity of wealth and power in the world is ludicrous. A bunch of Westerners wringing their hands over stuff that's happened in other places is not a fair world order. And I'm not talking about reparations or something for colonialism. I'm talking about a genuinely fair world order going forward in which decision-making power in global institutions is shared, actually shared. None of this has anything to do with that. None of the people who are morally grandstanding and virtue signaling about this are prepared to actually share wealth and power with people in poor countries. And so it's all performative. They're just hypocrites. And they use aesthetics and moral posturing to distract you from how little they're willing to do politically and how disinterested they are in the politics of global justice, which is a category that to them is totally unimportant.
So there's a set of a bunch of trees in Victoria in Australia that are set to be bulldozed as part of some plans to build a freeway. And I'm not joking. There were multiple articles written about this in Australia earlier this week. Demolition of 800-year-old sacred trees compared to Notre Dame fire. Indigenous affairs commentators have compared France's Notre Dame cathedral fire to the impending demolition of 800-year-old trees. A massive fire ravaged the 850-year-old Gothic building this week, destroying much of its roof and causing its steeple to collapse. Parisians spoke about how the cathedral fire has made them think about identity, memory, and shared culture. In Australia, some took to social media to make comparisons with the situation close to home. Devastating news. So this is Ray Johnson on Twitter. Devastating news about Notre Dame. A genuine shame to see a beautiful, historic, spiritual place destroyed. In Australia, this happens all the time, usually for the purposes of mining development or, in the case of the 800-plus-year-old Dja Burong birthing trees, a highway. Another one. As Notre Dame birds, I can't help but think of these sacred Dja Burong trees. The potential loss is the same, 800 years. Both deeply spiritual places of sanctuary, of faith, of deep connection and healing. And this is another one, Ruby Wharton. Notre Dame had a fire. Get over it or start practicing what you preach. On the East Coast, there's an 800-year-old sacred birthing tree that the government wants to bulldoze. Deaving Creek Mission is under development threats. Mining companies constantly desecrate sites. Double standards.
I'm sure those trees mean to some people what Notre Dame means to many people. But they don't mean the same thing to all people, which Notre Dame means to the people who are most upset about it. And it really is okay for some people to value some sites more than others on a purely aesthetic basis. Egalitarianism is not something that is aesthetically applicable. You are under no duty to value all art or all architecture or all religious sites the same from a beauty standpoint. No one is. That's not the relevant kind of standard for assessing art. The relevant standard for assessing art is this to my taste? And your taste can be as weird and messy as you want it to be. And if your taste is glass pyramids, okay, you can have that taste. And if you've got enough political power to get them to build a glass pyramid on top of Notre Dame, good for you. But me and the people who have a different aesthetic taste are also going to try to use political power to get the kinds of things that we want built. And that has nothing to do with our taste being better or your taste being better in some objective sense. It just has to do with what you like and what you happen to care about aesthetically.
But I think what's being imputed here is something more than aesthetics, right? Like the claim here isn't like, here is something that is also beautiful. The claim here is like, you motherfuckers care about X, but here's my issue, and you don't care about that, therefore you're a bad person.
Well, I haven't
that's what's
been to that
being
forest.
Claimed, right?
I haven't seen the forest. I don't have any relationship to the forest. There's some group of people who have been to that forest and have seen it and have that kind of relationship to that forest, and it makes sense for those people to care about that. But I mean, there's some people who watch every Star Wars movie and love Star Wars, and their life is about Star Wars. And for them, every Star Wars movie is a big deal. I'm not one of those people.
Okay, all right. So we move on from the trees. But I've got another take. It's piping hot. This one is an op-ed. It's filed under racial justice. As we mourn Notre Dame, let us also remember black churches also matter. When Notre Dame burned, I mourned a beautiful cathedral, a destination, a sanctuary for quiet invocation. Notre Dame was also an architectural gem, a landmark for more than 850 years. The collapse of its beautiful spire was heartbreaking to see. I am glad that the world stopped, recognized that the fire that engulfed the cathedral roof was a significant loss to us all, and gathered, albeit virtually, to bear witness. While I felt sad as I watched news coverage of the Paris event, as a woman of color, I couldn't help but also feel a certain indignation, a kind of anger, an unexpressed rage, the kind of unexpressed rage that for over 400 years, black folks have just swallowed like a communion wafer in pursuit of infinite grace. My sadness mixed with resentment, partly because stretching over a 10-day period in one rural Louisiana town last month, 3 black churches burned to the ground. Officials recently arrested a white man, Holden Matthews, and charged him with a hate crime. This one case is enough to spark sorrow, but it's not the sole reason for my consternation. The list of documented cases of African American churches attacked by arsonists is long. And on that long list, there are, of course, only the cases that have been documented. How many other places dedicated to the liberation of the black spirit have been incinerated over the centuries?
Well, the idea that arson is there's more.
As I watched the international coverage of Notre Dame, a chant echoed in my head. Black churches also matter. This was a response to lopsided news coverage that centers white spaces. There is a real injury in the Notre Dame story, a macabre, surreal irony too. Black bodies bled to provide those spaces where whiteness is centered.
There are black Catholics who love the hell out of that church, out of Notre Dame. So the idea that it doesn't belong to black people is ridiculous. If you are African and you come to Paris, I'm sure that you have a great time at that cathedral. The notion that your church is entitled to the kind of reverence that Notre Dame is entitled to is just not a valid notion, because there are a lot of people who architecturally appreciate Notre Dame who have not been to other churches, have not seen those other churches, and don't have any kind of emotional connection to those other churches and the architectural style in which they were constructed. And that has nothing to do with them not valuing blackness, and everything to do with the fact that a lot of American churches, and I'm not just talking black churches, but churches of every denomination, are kind of dull looking and not nearly as cool as these European cathedrals, in part because they're newer, in part because they're constructed in a more modern architectural style. They just look shabby compared to the European cathedrals. And I would say that of the white churches, I would say that of churches of every description in the United States, the mega churches that people go to, American churches are ugly as sin compared to European churches.
Did you say MAGA churches?
Yeah. The churches that most of the Trump voters go to, they're ugly as hell. They're disgusting. This is not about race. This is about some buildings more people find beautiful than others.
Can I just clarify historical trivia? So Notre Dame was completed in what? The mid 14th century, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought from memory, but I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah,
so,
the 1300s.
Yeah. So in that era, to what extent was, and I'm just playing the ingenue here for the sake of the audience. In that era, to what extent was France a colonial power?
Not at all. France was still fighting the 100 Years' War with England, which was about expelling England from France and unifying France. That was still ongoing. That conflict didn't end until the mid-1400s, more than a century after the cathedral was finished.
So in this op-ed writer, Issa Nefertari Ulan writes that the commodification of black and brown bodies filled French coffers, and that black bodies bled to provide those spaces where whiteness is centered. Like, if we are in fact speaking about the Notre Dame Cathedral, which in fact
the Americas were not yet discovered. France had no possessions in Africa. Colonialism did not build that cathedral. Simply didn't. Now, you might argue that maybe some
So you're saying
funds
that black bodies didn't bleed to provide those spaces where whiteness is centered?
Not that space. Now, you might argue that maybe some of the money to pay to maintain it over the centuries came out of that. Somehow, I think that the French would have found a way to maintain it anyway. A lot of European powers that did not possess colonies nonetheless were able to maintain a lot of their historical spaces. A lot of Middle Eastern states and African states still contain considerable ruins from the past, some much older than Notre Dame. If you go to Tunisia, or you go to Libya, you can find all kinds of old, antique, classical ruins from 1,000 years before Notre Dame was constructed or more. The notion that this is all to do with colonialism is just simply absurd. There's a lot that's to do with colonialism, but this isn't it. And your pet cause has no business here.
So
it just has no business.
So this person then writes that prior to the Notre Dame fire, the Louisiana churches that Holden Matthews is charged with destroying had raised about $50,000 in donations to help rebuild. After Notre Dame, contributions rose to $1.8 million. These gifts are beautiful, an expression of infinite grace. They likely came from plenty of regular folks, and they are not reparations. As we sing Ave Maria, sing also for black churches set aflame by racialized hate. Blah, blah, blah.
Arson is bad. Racially motivated arson is bad, but it has nothing to do with this. And this is just an effort to shoehorn a different issue into the conversation.
No, this is where it starts to really become relevant. While some justifiably interrogate French billionaires who have committed to rebuilding Notre Dame but never met with French yellow vests who have been protesting for a path out of poverty, not enough of us are questioning the source of the wealth that enabled the privilege of Notre Dame in the first place. So many black and brown bodies splayed, maimed, raped, and then blithely consumed in every early morning French cafe.
It was the peasants of France who built that. It was the serfs who built that. Those are the people whose blood, sweat, and tears went into Notre Dame.
Are you saying they don't eat black and brown
they were not all white.
In the French
I'm
cafe?
sure they weren't all white. Some of them may have been black or brown, but they weren't being employed by the
le baguette and le croissant, le café.
I'm sure there were some serfs in medieval France who were black or brown, but they were not being picked to build Notre Dame on the basis of race because the concept of race did not exist in the Middle Ages.
Are you sure they weren't being blithely consumed in every early morning French cafe with le faux, le François?
It's just ignorant. It's so ignorant. It's weaponized ignorance.
Croissant?
You're just enjoying aggravating me now, aren't you?
Yeah, a little.
Yeah, you are. You are. I see it. I see what you're up to.
Do you want more? I've got more.
Oh, God. Is it at least a slightly different genre from this?
No.
Is it really, guys? There are lots of these other issues matter. I'm not even saying they don't matter. I'm just saying that you can't, well, you can, but you shouldn't trade off this issue to promote other causes or criticize people for caring about the aesthetic stuff that they care about. It's like getting upset because some people are writing posts about how they feel that Game of Thrones has been ruined or something. By all means, don't be interested, but don't tell them that how dare you write about Game of Thrones when all of these other things are happening in the world. It's just a childish attitude. Let people have their things. People have different kinds of aesthetic things that they like. Let people have their things and don't try to politicize it. You don't have to like everything everybody else likes. You don't have to like the architectural style. You don't have to like the church. You don't have to like Notre Dame. But let people have things that they like. The world is harsh enough as it is without everybody trying to take every piece of art everybody likes away from everybody else. There are all kinds of pieces of art that I don't like, but I try to avoid giving people a hard time about it. I try to look at it as in some ways a flaw in myself, that I'm not able to get past some aspect of it and find something to appreciate. For instance, the Marvel superhero movies, I find them unwatchable. But if you like them, it doesn't make you a bad person. And if we met, would try to avoid giving you a hard time about it. And maybe if we became good friends, I might razz you now and then a little bit, but only in friendship. And that's what the attitude ought to be to this. If you don't like this building and you don't like the architecture, well, maybe razz your friends who like it a little bit if you want, but don't weaponize it. Just let people have things.
That really, I do think there's an aspect of this that actually diminishes. Like, if you use this as a wedge issue to imply that one can't care about this without necessarily somehow being Islamophobic or Eurocentric or, some other problematic ist or ism, I think you actually do a disservice to interest in whatever your particular cause is, because by framing everything in a totally zero-sum fashion, what you actually do is alienate the potential for the breadth of interest in your particular cause. So by framing it as this in this competitive fashion, which it need not be, I think you tend to alienate people more than articulating the ways in which whatever your particular thing is in fact a mutual thing. So I sort of occasionally, from people who don't understand my politics particularly well, will sort of get shit for the fact that I'm not rah feminism. And the reason I'm not that way is because I struggle to think of anything that is, quote, a feminist issue that is not actually an everyone issue. I'm a socialist, and I really have difficulty thinking of any issue that, feminists would describe as a feminist issue that to me is not in fact a collective issue. So to my mind, something like, parental leave, that's about allowing, parents to have a sufficient amount of time with their kids when they're super young in a way that allows them to bond with their kids. There's nothing exclusively female or feminine or, related to one particular gender about that. That's about families and raising families, and being able to raise kids is something that is to the collective good as a society. And I think the more frequently we can frame our issues as ones that as many people as possible can get on board with and see as relevant to them, then you increase the propensity of, people to build, a critical mass of support for them such that you can actually move the lever. And I think the pernicious aspect of framing everything in this totally kind of negative, condescending, scoldy manner, yeah, sure, it might get you 5 minutes in a newspaper because this is, the story of a couple of days news cycle. But I actually think it's really fucking cheap and tawdry, and it actually alienates people. And I
feel
really
alienated by it. I'll admit that. I feel very much alienated by it. And,
but I think it's a really anti-socialist, like totally fucking neoliberal frame that would seek to atomize and turn everything into a zero sum. Whereas if you could
go around and tell people that their aesthetic tastes are bigoted, that's a way to make people feel like they want to work with you or be part of what you're doing. And by the way, I just looked it up out of morbid curiosity, and Avengers Infinity War cost about $500 million to make, which is very nearly as much as Notre Dame. So if you can have that one movie, can I please have a roof on Notre Dame that looks acceptable?
Well, that's the other thing. Like, no one's talking about capital. Like, no one's talking about capital. We're whinging about one particular thing. Because it has some vague
under capitalism,
similarity.
we've got this big entertainment industry, and it makes all kinds of art and so on for people. And a lot of it is, from a certain point of view, say a grotesque waste of money. And by all means, let's take the state and let's change the way we distribute resources. But to say that some people's aesthetic tastes, which are administered to by capital on a regular basis, are more valid than other people's tastes that aren't, I just don't see it. We live in a world where there's a bunch of money that's going to be spent on entertainment. Let everybody have their share while this horrible system continues, because the arts and entertainment sector is one of the few things that keeps people from killing themselves. So let people have their share of stupid art. Just let people have it. Life's hard enough.
I think
Go pursue political change. Construct socialism on the political level. Don't go around taking art from people and telling them that they can't have it.
And scolding and turning it into a zero-sum game. Because if you actually think about it, like one of the facts that I read earlier where I said like something... the Louisiana churches had previously raised $50,000 in contributions, and subsequent to this, that jumped up to $1.8 million. So I read that and we passed over it, and it didn't sound like much. But then you actually think about it, and that's kind of amazing. Like, you'd previously raised $30,000, and then all of a sudden, in the wake of the Notre Dame fire, the fundraising total multiplied by 30 times to 1.8. Wait, not even 30, more than 30.
Well, I'm happy
40.
for them that they were able to find people who want to contribute.
No, but the point is that this was actually, like, in some ways, this was consciousness raising for the issue that they had closer to home. Like, it actually... to one degree or another, was somewhat beneficial in terms of their fundraising efforts.
Right. And so then they're saying...
rather than framing this as like a...
something that helps all churches and all historical places that are in need by increasing people's awareness in general of the need to maintain stuff.
You can frame this in a way that's solidaristic, right? But instead, like this... hideous zero-sum logic that actually doesn't achieve what you want it to achieve in much the same way as I hate to fucking say it. But, like, I think there's been a very robust critique about the notion of Black Lives Matter. Whilst the sentiment is absolutely true, it's a total fucking no-brainer. It fails to mobilize the collective solidarity needed to leverage the type of change that's necessary. And ultimately...
yeah, because it's turned policing into a black issue rather than an everybody issue. And
indeed, and when we look at the facts...
excesses of police violence, it's an everybody issue. Yes, black people are killed much more often than white people in the United States, but white Americans are killed a hell of a lot more often by police than Europeans.
No, but when black people are not killed more often, they're statistically disproportionately killed
that's what I mean.
To that percentage of the population. But white people are killed more often.
Yeah,
like,
that's
as
what I
a
meant.
brute fact. Yeah.
Yes,
So,
that's
but
true.
ultimately, what I'm saying is like, it is a sufficient enough issue that in racializing it, what we actually do is alienate the majority of people who are killed by cops. And like, what we need to be talking about is police violence and people being killed at the hands of cops. And like, yeah, those people are disproportionately African American, but the majority of people killed by cops are white. And so why the fuck would you alienate the majority of people who are also dealing with what is a collective problem as opposed to a racialized one? And in much the same way, this zero-sum race reductionist logic that is somehow now being applied to architecture and aesthetics and any manner of any other issue that seems to pop into the news, not only is it reductionist and it forces us to make, I think, really unnuanced and straight up inaccurate reads on history, but it's actually like alien to a socialist politics. Socialist politics is about mobilizing a mass base of people around the issues that we believe to be important to the working class. And like, whenever we talk about racial issues, in much the same way as I refer to gendered issues, it's a very rare instance in which a racialized analytic or a gendered analytic offers us more than an actual solidaristic, widespread analytic. And like, you know, in the same way with churches, the destruction of historic churches is a fucking tragedy. And it's not a tragedy because they're black or because they're white. It's a tragedy because these are places of, you know, spiritual levity for significant numbers of people.
And historical interest and architectural interest.
Exactly.
Beautiful places. It doesn't have to be.
I just think when we atomize these things as though they are in some way racialized or, you know, uniquely of interest only to a very narrow portion of the population, we do a disservice not only to ourselves and to our particular cause, but also to the actual cause of a solidaristic politics.
And this is the kind of thinking which causes people to overlook those black churches in the first place because they're considered black churches rather than just churches.
Exactly. It's a really zero-sum atomized logic. Yeah,
because African Americans are 13% of the population, sticking the word black in front of it says to 87%, not for you, not your concern.
And, you know, to really ram it home, like, police violence is fucking everyone's concern.
Yeah, it's a civil liberties issue that's been turned into a race issue. And in the course of doing that, it's become much harder to do anything. It's a civil liberties issue.
Of course it is.
For everybody. Well, anything left to say about all of that?
They're just that all lives matter.
Well, and I'll just close with one of the things my history professor pointed out to me on Twitter is that, yes, people have attempted to reappropriate a lot of old buildings for a lot of new causes. And I just want to say that every time in history they've done it, it was wrong too. Every time in history that they've tried to make anything about race or ethnicity or nationality, they've been wrong. And the fact that an old building at various points in time has attempted to be claimed by various groups of people, we don't let them succeed in making it theirs. They don't get to say that Notre Dame is a symbol of whiteness or a symbol of right nationalism or a symbol of anything. They don't get to claim anything in that way. It doesn't belong to them. And don't give it to them. Don't give the right-wingers all of this stuff. They want to make everything that any white person, any European person has ever built or ever made something that belongs to a right-wing movement. And they're not entitled to that. Don't help them out. That's all I got to say about that. Thank you guys for listening to me get aggravated about an issue that may not be of much consequence to many of you. It's not all that important, really. It's just an example of the kind of thing that grinds my gears. It's just a building, even if it's really pretty and old and so on.
I'm pretty and old, but I'm not a building.
Oh, you're not old.
I thought you were going to say you're not pretty. It's like,
Well,
geez,
I'm not going to say that. Come
not on the recording. Jeez. Alrighty, that's about all from us for now. But we shall catch you next time, patrons. If you've yet to do so, leave us a review on the iTunes Store or wherever you get podcasts. And if you want to reach out to us, we can be found at whatisleftpod@gmail.com and on Twitter at whatisleftpod. But I believe that for now is all that's left. Bye.
Bye.